Croeso pawb, hello and welcome to this Carlam Cymru e-sgol Booster A-Level English Literature session. This is session 1 and it is going to be on Unit 3, Section A of the Pre-1900 Poetry exam. Now, I'm going to focus just on the one question in this session, which is going to be on the named poem with 15 marks in section A. But just to give you a breakdown of the exam paper, just to remind you here exactly what it is you'll be expected to do in the Unit 3 exam. So it's a 2-hour exam and it's an open book, clean copy exam. Now, it is separated into 2 sections. You have section A, which is on the studied poet collection that you've been looking at in class, pre-1900. Now, there are 2 questions that you'll need to answer for this section A. The first is on a named poem. So the question will give you a specific poem or extract from your extended narrative poem. And that is going to be worth 15 marks. And that's what we're going to concentrate on today. But also in section A, you will have an extended essay question with 45 marks on your studied poet. There is also section B, which is the unseen poetry comparison. Both section A and section B are worth 60 marks in total each. But just for today, we're going to concentrate on that named poem of your poetry collection, that 15-mark question. So for this question, as I said previously, it's worth 15 marks and you are only assessed on 2 assessment objectives for this particular question. You are assessed on A01, which is worth 5 marks, and A02, which is worth 10 marks. So it is just those 2 assessment objectives for the first question. You are not marked at all on A03, which is the context, or A05, which is that named alternative interpretation or critical interpretation. However, you are able to work in alternative interpretations into this response because you will be marked via AO2 on alternative interpretations of a poem. But just to remind you and recap, AO1 and AO2 are the only assessment objectives you are marked on for this first question, so there is no need to include any context whatsoever because you will not be awarded marks for it. Okay, so let's have a look at those 2 assessment objectives in a little bit more detail. Now, you should be reasonably familiar with the assessment objectives at this point, but just in case you need a little recap and a breakdown of them, here they are. So AO1, 5 marks. That is your ability to articulate informed, personal and creative responses to the poem named, using associated concepts and terminology and coherent, accurate written expression. So that AO1 has 3 facets to it. It's your ability to write an articulate, creative response to the poem. It's your ability to use correct terminology, and it is your ability to write in a coherent and accurate way. Now let's have a little look at the Band 5 descriptors. What is it we actually need to do to get full marks for this assessment objective? Well, if you were to be assessed in Band 5, it would mean that your response is sophisticated, creative and individual in its response to the poem or extract. Your ideas are thoughtful and your response is fully engaged and relevant. So basically, your response is totally engaged with the question throughout and you do not go off on tangents, you are focused on the task at hand. It is also confident, perceptive application of literary concepts and terminology, meaning that you are able to spot where technique has been used by the poet. You are able to accurately name that term, and then you are able to articulate why that term has been used and the effectiveness of the term. Your work will also be effectively organised and demonstrating flair, and you will show high levels of technical accuracy and adopt a clear academic style and register throughout. So again, just to recap, there are 3 facets to this assessment objective. Your ability to write in a fully engaged and relevant way, so you're staying focused on the task. Your ability to confidently use concepts and terminology, and also that your ideas are organized, you are following a chronological format, and you're showing high levels of technical accuracy. What that means is that you are writing and articulating in an accurate way. Now, again, you may not think that you are marked on spelling, punctuation, grammar, paragraphing, and so on in English literature too much. However, that does come under AO1. So what we need to do is, after we have completed our exam paper, it is vitally important that you go back through your answers and you read, proofread and edit anything that needs alteration, or any sentencing that's a little clunky that might need to be adapted, because that is assessed in AO1. On to AO2 then, which is worth 10 marks for this question. It is your ability to analyse ways in which meanings are shaped in literary texts. So what that means is your ability to dig deep into the named poem and explore how meaning has been shaped not only through language, but also form and structure. We mustn't forget that form and structure. So let's have a little look at the Band 5 criteria once again for this AO. If you were to be assessed as Band 5, your piece would show perceptive, sophisticated analysis and evaluation of the writer's use of language and poetic techniques to create meaning. It would show confident and apt textual support, and there would be confident discussion of implicit meaning. So again, in this assessment objective, we've got 3 facets to it. The first is your ability to dig deep for meaning in the language, form and structure, as well as the techniques that have been used by this poet. It is also, however, important that you use confident and apt textual support, quotational support from the poem. So we're not just exploring meaning, we are supporting the assertions we make by apt, well-chosen textual support. And then that final bullet point then, confident discussion of implicit meaning, that is historically what would have been AO5 in another question. So it's your ability to dig deep for meaning and also acknowledge that the poem or parts of the poem can be acknowledged in different ways, can be interpreted in perhaps more than one way. More about that then a little later on. Just to remind you though that no further assessment objectives are assessed in this first question. Just focus on AO1 and AO2. So before we begin then, what I need to make sure is that we all know the importance of correct poetic terminology. And what I mean by that is you must demonstrate to the examiner that you are fully aware that this is a poem that you are exploring. Now, it may seem silly and self-explanatory, but what I mean by this is not only the technical terms, but also those basic poetic terms, referring to it as a poem, referring to them as stanzas rather than paragraphs or sections, referring to quotations, referring to the narrator or the speaker or the poet rather than the author. So we must make sure that we know, and we're showing the examiner we know, that this is a poem at all times. That's the first part. Now, also at this point in your A-level, you will also be familiar with many of the technical poetic terms and terminology that there are. And just to give you a little recap and help with revising some of those, I have included a poetry glossary, and that can be found in the Teams folder to do with this particular session. Now, you may not be familiar with all of these poetic terms, and please don't worry if you aren't, because they're not all going to be relevant to your studied poet, but a lot of them will be very familiar to you and will be those keystone poetic terms such as alliteration, allusion, assonance, blank verse, caesura, and so on. Again, that poetry glossary can be found in the Teams folder along with this recording. And I really advise you to have a little look at those, because they will help you to revise those technical terms and make sure that you're fully au fait with them and know what it is that you'll need to be doing. Okay, so how should we tackle this first question on Unit 3? What I've done here is I've created a 6-step, step-by-step approach to tackling this question every time. Now that might be in a practice, it might be in revision, or it might be in the exam itself. You can always follow this 6-step approach to answering this particular question. And the steps are as follows. So you open your Unit 3 exam paper, you find your named poet, the poet that you have been studying, the collection of poems, and you find the named question. So what we need to do first of all is step 1. We need to read this question carefully and highlight the key words and commands that it is asking us. What I mean by that is that it is likely that it won't ask you to look at the poem line by line, but it'll ask you to explore the presentation of a particular theme or idea to do with that poet. You need to highlight that particular theme or idea, because that will be the crux of this question and how to answer it to gain the most marks. Step 2 then will be to take your clean copy and reread the poem or the section of the larger poem that you've been asked to look at. Don't make any notes in this first reading. Just read through the poem, refamiliarize yourself with the poem, and also in the back of your mind, just have what that key command or key theme is that it is asking you to look for. But there's no need to make any notes at this point. Just refamiliarize yourself with the poem and take a deep breath. Step 3 will be to get an overview of the poem in the light of the task. So as you're rereading this poem, like I said, keep in mind the key theme or idea that you have been asked to look at, because that will be key for the next step. So step 4 then, we're going to reread the poem again, and this time we're going to start making annotations and notes to do with the question. Now remember, these can be notes on tone, keywords used, key phrases, imagery that the poet has used, allusions to other things, poetic techniques that have been used, and so on. Just go through the poem, annotating and making notes based on that task and what it is asking you to look for. Now, these notes can be created any way that you wish. You can write the notes on the question paper, because remember, the question paper isn't going off to the examiner. It's going to stay in the school after the exam. You can make the notes on the clean copy of the poem if you've been provided with that. But you can also make your notes in your pink answer booklet, and that is absolutely fine. What you are expected to do is make planning notes for every question. But the examiner will not be expecting to mark these planning notes. And if you write things in your pink answer booklet that you don't want assessed by the examiner, then you just put a line or a cross through those planning notes after you have finished. Don't worry if you don't remember to put a line through it. The examiner will know which is the response and which is the planning section. Once you've done your annotations then, Step 5, review your notes in light of the keywords from the question. We've always got to be pulling it back to the question, making sure the notes that we have made remain relevant. I cannot stress that enough. Once you've done all of those things, step 6 is to begin writing your response, again, focusing on the task, the poem, and AO2. Now, in this exam, it's a 2-hour exam, and you do have plenty of time to answer. Now, I do recommend that you spend between 30 and 45 minutes on this particular question, and you may want to spend a good 10 minutes at the start annotating and planning. Now, it may seem like a long time to spend on just note taking and annotating, but I cannot stress how important it is, because it will focus your attention on the task at hand and on the section or theme that you have been asked to look at in this particular poem. So let's have a look at those steps in a bit more detail. Step 1, read the question and highlight the key words or commands that have been asked. And here's an example of a John Donne question. Now, it does not matter if John Donne is not the poet that you have been studying, because all of the questions will be asked in a similar way. So this question then asks us to reread Hymn to God in My Sickness on pages 195 to 196. Examine Donne's use of imagery in this poem. And what you've got here is key highlighting of those words and commands. So the first highlighting then is focusing on the specific poem that it's asking you to look at. Hymn to God, in my sickness. That is the poem that you have been asked to look at. So we would highlight that. And then the crux of the question itself is examine Donne's use of imagery in this poem. So that is what we are looking for, Donne's use of imagery. It is not asking you to read through the poem and go through it line by line, giving a detailed analysis of the whole poem. It is asking you to select the relevant sections, i.e. Donne's use of imagery. So that is step 1. Let's go on to step 2. Again, then we reread the poem or extract of poem without making any notes, just to refamiliarize ourselves with the poem. This could be a poem that you're really familiar with, but it also could be a poem that you haven't looked at for a while. It could perhaps be a poem that you haven't studied before for various reasons. For this, then, it is really important that you just do that first rereading without making any notes, so you can focus on what it is that you have been asked to look for. You'll get an overview then of the poem in light of the task after this first rereading. And then in that second rereading, now is when we make our notes on tone, keywords, imagery, and so on based on the task. Remember to spend 5 to 10 minutes on those annotations. Once you have finished annotating, then you read through your annotations once again, making sure that they are focused on the task. So in this case, on the imagery used by Donne. Okay, step 5 then. So this is our poem, Hymn to God in My Sickness. Now I'm not going to read the poem out to you. You're either familiar with this poem because you studied Donne, or you're not particularly familiar with it. It doesn't matter. What I want to show you is reviewing those notes. So you can pause this recording to read through the poem, just to give yourself an idea of what it's about, or remind yourself about it. If it's not a poem or poet you're familiar with, and this might be a really good sort of thing for you to do, this will be a cold poem for you. So pause, read the poem, and then play again, and we'll look at the next sections. Okay, so here we've got examples of annotation of this poem then. Since I'm coming to that holy room where, with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music as I come, I tune the instruments here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map, who lie, if on this bed, that by then may be shown that this is my southwest discovery. Okay, and on it goes. Well, what I want to draw your attention to are the highlightings or the coloured sections and the annotations to go with it. As you see, this has not been a line-by-line analysis of this poem. I have chosen key sections of the poem that then deal with the question and the imagery that has been asked in the question. So let's have a little look at these notes then. We can see in this first stanza that there is an image of the poet being made God's music. It suggests melody, harmony, and richness. So that is one of the images that has been used. In that second stanza, Donne compares himself to a map, creating ideas of discovery and travel. The idea of death and resurrection are implied in references to west and east. On then to the continuation of the poem. The reference to straits is geographical, but can also be read as an image of suffering, which must be borne in order to reach heaven. The biblical allusion to Noah's family and the ark adds to this idea. So what you've got here in these annotations is the focus on AO2. We are looking at meaning and how it has been shaped and created by the poet. We're looking at allusions, imagery, we're looking at tone. So these are all annotations that concern themselves with AO2, and they are very select. What is also very select is the textual support. As you can see in the coloured sections, there are no full lines that have been chosen. They are key, apt pieces of textual support. So please don't feel that you have to copy out lines and lines and lines of poetry for this question. In fact, that is actually going to be detrimental to you. It is much better to select key textual evidence to support your analysis. So let's move on then to see how this would look. Writing your response. And what I've got here is an example of how I would write up this particular response to this particular poem. Hymn to God, my God, in my sickness was written when Donne believed he was going to die. In the opening stanza, Donne describes entering a holy room, meaning entering God's heaven after earth. Musical imagery is used to depict a tranquil and harmonious setting, with God's choir of saints suggesting his time in heaven will be spent serving God, and he will become music itself, a melodious and harmonious part of the choir of the saints, pleasing God. So that is our opening paragraph. As you can see, we go straight into the analysis. Now we start with a very brief overview of the poem, just to show the examiner immediately that we know what this poem is about and we know exactly where it is going. So as you can see to the first annotation on the left-hand side, I start with an overview of the poem, which will help me to focus my discussion of imagery in the poem and alert the examiner to my general understanding of the poem. So that's a really good way to start. Just give a brief overview of the poem, showing that you know it well and you know where it is going, because that will signal to the examiner your general understanding. On the right-hand side then, I've got that second annotation of that opening paragraph. In order to start getting credit immediately, I need to make sure I make a point that relates to the question in my first sentence. So after that first overview, you go straight into the analysis. Donne describes entering a holy room, meaning entering God's heaven after death. Musical imagery is used to depict a tranquil and harmonious setting, with God's choir of saints suggesting his time in heaven will be spent serving God. So we don't dilly-dally around, we go straight into that analysis. Remember, this is a 15-mark question and you want to get going straight away. You don't want any cranking up sentences. As you can also see, the textual evidence is very, very precise. As I said previously, that there are no lines copied out. It is very precise textual evidence that has been used, and it has been used in an integrated way. So it's integrated into the sentence. Let's have a look at that second paragraph then. Donne uses the imagery of maps and discovery to describe the way he is being studied by doctors, and that they will soon discover his journey is leading to death. The metaphysical conceit of Donne being the map itself is extended to the third stanza, where Donne uses images of east and west to describe his forthcoming resurrection. Okay, so let's have a look at that annotation on the left-hand side. As we can see, the question has been referred to twice, first in the opening paragraph and then secondly in the second paragraph. So we're keeping that focus on the question at all times. So let's look at that third annotation then. I need to use a range of examples to show a rich understanding of the poem. Being concise and clear is important. And then on the right-hand side, instead of using a line-by-line approach to my analysis, I'm showing the examiner I can select images and comment on them across the stanzas. So this candidate is being very, very precise. Now that is a very achievable way to start this particular question. As you can see, you got that overview to start, then you go straight into your analysis, and then in your second paragraph you continue the analysis, choosing from other sections of the poem, and you're following it in chronological order. So, how to revise this type of response? Now, it's really, really good to start revising pretty early. So this is a really good time to begin. So let's get ourselves ready for revision. We've got to check our designated list of poems, covering a range of topics and themes. Okay, so let's have a little look through our anthology. First of all, then, making sure that we have annotated everything that has been studied in class. If there is anything missing, if you were off sick or you're not quite sure, or you might have annotated somewhere else, that's your first port of call at this point. You need to speak to your teacher, and you need to make sure that you get those missing notes and you annotate your copy. This in itself is an act of revision because you will be refamiliarizing yourself with the key themes and ideas of your poet. What we also need to look at then, once we have done that, are the typical kinds of topics and themes that tend to come up with these poets. So in your pre-1900 poets section, as you start to look through the poems, you'll start to become familiar with the themes and ideas that are prevalent to that particular poet. You might want to make a list of these themes and ideas because you're going to come back to these later on. Once you've done that and you've looked through your annotations yourself, the next thing you need to do is get hold of past papers and past questions. Read through the past questions, make a list of them, see how they are generally worded, because what you will notice is that a pattern will start to be formed. They are usually written and asked in the same kind of way. There's also not an exhaustive list of themes and ideas, and what you will start to see is that these themes and ideas come up again and again and again. They might be worded differently, but they will always be there. So you need to make a list of those as well. Okay. So once we've done that, once we've looked through our annotated copy and we're making sure that we've got all our annotations up to date, and we've started looking at past papers and past questions and making lists of the types of things that come up, here is where we go next. So ideas for exploring a chosen poem or extract. So what you might want to do then is just pick a poem. You read through that poem and you start to look for certain things. So firstly, once you've read the poem, you need to check the meaning of any unfamiliar or unusual words. So for example, Odysseus in Donne's Love's Alchemy, that may be not a word that you're particularly familiar with. Doesn't matter because this is revision. So what we do is we check the meaning of any of these particular unfamiliar words. Note down the meaning in your annotations because this will help you revise later on. Then in our poem, we identify the verse form. Consider the power and effects of the sonnet form, for example, Rossetti's Autumn Violets. Narrative verse, the use of rhyming couplets, for example, in Goblin Market. So let's identify the verse form of this poem. Let's look out for patterns in language and imagery. Just like we did in that practice just now, let's pick out the language and the imagery that's been used because that's going to be the easiest thing to choose. Let's consider the tone of language choices and the significance of punctuation. Punctuation is not just used by accident. For example, for God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love in Donne's The Canonization. And we're going to examine the ways in which the poet creates a range of tones, moods, or attitudes. So these are all ideas for how to revise. Once you've chosen a poem, these are the kinds of things that you might want to look for as you're starting to read through. And this is good practice. It might not be something that comes to you naturally, but as you do more and more and more, it will start to become like second nature to you. But don't worry if it feels unfamiliar and forced and quite clunky at first. Approaches then to creating our own questions. So we've had a little look through the past questions. We've had a little look at the past exam papers. Now what you may want to do is start to create your own questions. You might start to see the particular patterns that come up in these exam questions and start to gaining confidence to create your own questions to help you revise. So you take your selected poem or extract and consider the different angles from which it might be approached. Under the heading Analyse the way in which the poet presents, think about the variety of different themes and ideas that are in this poem that could be drawn on. Use these then to form your own questions, and these can be about anything at all. Use the past questions to help you. These could be about things like romantic love, religious devotion, self-reproach, fear, women, presentation of women, faith and hope, complex ideas, metaphysics, disappointment. You will be most familiar with the kinds of things to be found in your particular poet's collection, and so you'll be able to make best use of this list and discount any that don't often come up in your particular poet. Exercising then, once we've started to gather all our notes, this is how we would practice. Choose 2 to 3 of the themes or topics from your list of approaches and write the first 2 paragraphs of a response for both. So take one poem, work out perhaps 2 or 3 themes or topics or ideas that are shown in these poems, in this poem, and then write the first 2 paragraphs of response for both or all 3 of these themes. This is good practice because it will get you used to doing that particular formula, that overview, that straight into the analysis of that particular idea and straight into the analysis once again. Take careful note of the way you shape your response differently but relevantly from the start. The more you practice this type of task, the more you'll be able to see how carefully crafted the response needs to be. No words can be wasted on waffle, so the more you do, the better it'll be. Finally then, some do's and don'ts. And this is just to recap everything that we've gone through in this particular recording for this first question on Unit 3. So when you're thinking about your response, do start it directly and relevantly. Remember, a brief overview and then you go straight into your analysis. Do look for patterns of language and imagery in the poem. Do make and support your points succinctly. Don't copy out long lines of poetry because you will not be awarded marks for it. Be succinct in your textual support. Do use tentative language, and this will be something you'll be familiar with from Unit 2 in AS level. Tentative language tends to be sentences like, this could perhaps demonstrate this. Alternatively, this could be read as this. That could, might. This is all tentative language that signposts to the examiner that you are aware of implicit meaning and that the poem can be interpreted in more than one way. Do use technical terminology to demonstrate the extent of your understanding, but use it accurately. If you're not quite sure that that's what it is, don't use it. But if you are sure, then you can use it to show off. But you must not just use that term on its own. You must name the term and then explain the effect of the use of that term. Do take care with your expression, remember to paragraph, and remember to proofread your response once you're finished. I've mentioned it previously, but it is so important. Once you finish your exam paper, you will have time to go back and reread through everything, proofreading your response and also editing where needed. Finally, the don'ts then. Don't start at the first line of the poem or extract of poem and work through line by line. We've ascertained now that that will not gain you marks and it will lead you to drift onto irrelevant things. Don't write descriptively or narratively about the poem. You have to be succinct. The examiner knows this poem. They know what the poem is about. There is no need for you to overly explain in a story format what the poem is talking about, and you're not going to get awarded marks for it. Don't write lengthy and clunky introductions. Okay, you need something very concise, like this is a poem written in the 17th century by John Donne in memory of his deceased wife Anne End. A nice overview, very short, very brief, very succinct and to the point. If you're including lengthy and clunky introductions, then you're wasting your time. Don't make extended or extensive reference to context. Remember, you're not assessed on that in this first question. Don't use very long quotations or copy out large chunks of the text. And don't use technical terms descriptively and for their own sake. That's everything covered there for that first question of the Unit 3 Section A Poetry exam. I really hope that that's been useful for you. Please make sure that you watch this recording and make any notes, or if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to get in touch with the e-sgol team. I look forward to seeing you again for the second recording for the extended essay response and the unseen poetry comparison essay. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.